deadbeat dads, drug warlords, daily shootouts, crime-infested projects. I'm not describing a scene from The Wire. This is how I saw that communities of color were being portrayed in the media when I began my professional writing career over a decade ago. As an editor and reporter, I would edit travel books about the area where I grew up and lived, Southeast Queens, and I covered that local beat. At the time, the portrayal of people of color was terrible. It was always about someone getting shot or stabbed. And that wasn't the neighborhood that I grew up in and lived. And that didn't reflect the people that I knew, the store owners who stood outside and greeted neighbors. Neighbors that bonded together during crisis and shared block parties together in the summer. Fathers out early getting their kids to school or playing with them in the park. People that dedicated their time and effort to make sure their communities were better, stronger. And I was frustrated that those stories weren't being told. And so were my friends and neighbors. As a result, more and more people were turning away from mainstream media. So I decided to take a chance on this idea I had to start a news organization, produce a newspaper, one based totally on my community. And I shopped around to get funding, received smiles and nods, nothing more. I mean, who is fool enough to start a news organization? Who in this day and age puts out a newspaper, especially one geared to Black folks? My name is Clements Roach, and I'm the founder of Communities of Color News. I started the news over 6 years ago as little more than an idea born from frustration at the way things were. Today, Communities of Color reaches over 20,000 individuals in Southeast Queens, Far Rockaway, and Central Brooklyn. We are online and in print. We have been honored as being a business in Queens that is best for New York for the last 3 years in a row. We started just by telling stories that spoke to the Black consciousness and issues that affected people of color locally. We were covering the flooding in Southeast Queens, stop and frisk practices, lack of public resources, politicians, apathy in the community, and especially elections. We were giving residents updates about candidates. We were telling these stories and giving timelines and updates and in-depth analysis from a resident's perspective. Articles about what was really happening in the community, not just the crime blotter report. We produced a series of trackers. There we tracked school performance, as many failing schools were in our area. We also tracked pending legislation, we followed campaign issues, and we tracked the progress of local elected officials. This was news critical to this community that wasn't being provided. As we were telling these stories, we found that we were developing a context of celebration, community spirit. What made us different as a news organization was we were celebratory and not sensational. And that community spirit, that celebration, it was evident in our color centerfold. We always had pictures of people of color in their community doing what it is they're doing, at church, at an event, volunteering, protesting, voting. Annually, we look at fathers and their children. One year, we covered a father-daughter dance, and the photos were amazing. These beautiful young girls in these evening gowns, posing next to their very dapper dads. And this was something people of color didn't regularly see themselves represented positively and consistently in the news. The first hint that I got that things were changing was the swift way that newspapers were leaving the newsstand. While other papers seemed to languish on stands, ours was flying off the shelf, and I didn't know what was going on. This was a community that wasn't used to this type of news. Maybe store managers didn't want to stock them. I had to figure out what was going on. So I staged a stakeout. I planted some newspapers at a site, and then I waited across the street to see what was going to happen, and people were taking the newspapers, some several copies at a time. And when I confronted one store manager who got tired of me staking out his place, he said, people are taking the copies fast and you need to leave more. Another indication that things were resonating was the reaction from elected officials. All of a sudden, they were interacting with me differently. One elected official that the newspaper had mentioned, hadn't been showing up at local events, had me stop as I had finished covering an event, and I was just leaving. And then they ran over to me just to make sure I got a quote from them and saw that they were at the event. Another elected official invited me to their office just to make sure things are okay with us. They had been called out in a tracker because they hadn't been responding to our repeated attempts for information. These changes aren't to be taken lightly because what some people might not understand is the news is a business. Of course, CNN wants you to have all the news you need for your daily lives, to build your community. But they're able to do that because they receive support in the form of advertisers. The correlation between news organization and advertisers is particularly important in communities of color because other areas tend to receive more and better coverage because they have more in the form of support. When we came on the scene, it highlighted that yes, this community does want this kind of information, and yes, there is support for that. And we saw others catching on to that, wanting to tell stories that spoke directly to people of color on subjects like economic development, entrepreneurship, and police community relations. In the summer of 2014, we did extensive coverage surrounding the Eric Garner case. You might remember Mr. Garner. He was killed while being taken into custody for selling loose cigarettes. And this touched a nerve in communities of color. People were protesting, they were angry, they were upset. This was news we felt important to cover because it was that voice that wasn't being represented. As I was placing newspapers on stands with the cover headline, "Still Marching," and photos from a recent protest in support of Mr. Gardner, it sat alongside newspapers that talked about the summertime, surf's up, beach time. We were clearly having a different conversation, but it was one that I saw others wanted to take part in because as I returned to the places and events that I typically covered, all of a sudden I would see news reporters there that I had never seen news reporters before. As a result of our reporting and in response to the newspaper, there's also the onslaught of negative feedback. There are always the calls from people complaining about an article that doesn't go or didn't go the way that they thought it should. Elections typically stir up the lion's share of those phone calls. One particularly heated election cycle, I got a call from a candidate who yelled at me for about 20 minutes. He was very upset because he felt he was the front runner and was upset this article didn't properly demonstrate that fact. Well, he didn't win the election. I got yelled at National Night Out, this big local fair in the park, because a candidate representative felt like our news coverage favored one candidate over another, so they proceeded to give me a very loud civics lesson in the park. I had a lady yell at me because she felt that we had unfairly outed her as a leak in our e-newsletter. I have reports from people who we have covered truthfully, but they feel unfavorably tossing newspapers, having campaigns against us so others don't take newspapers, slandering us so that we don't get business. We get looked down upon because we're in print, and some say print is passé. We get overlooked in favor of media that caters to the mainstream. We get shunned by some business and civic leaders that do not believe in our audience. I had a particularly heated exchange with a former elected official who said that we were reporting fake news about him. The newspaper has been called a rag, and we have been compared to the New York Post. Remember, newspapers are flying off shelves in an area where people of color are continually told that they don't read newspapers. I tell you these stories so you know what to look out for when you become the change. More so you don't get discouraged when you're on your journey, because you're gonna face some negativity, and the negativity is gonna hurt. Because this is all personal, you're following your dreams, and an ounce of negativity can feel monumental. It felt monumental to me. I'm out here giving this all I got. I'm staking newsstands, But when things don't go the way you want, and the bad calls outnumber the good, when an issue doesn't perform like I would like, and the advertisers don't come, and if just one more person yells at me in the street, when those things would happen, it would make me feel like the news wasn't working, like we were being laughed at for our efforts. And then I would watch other newspapers thrive. And I'm facing all these challenges while telling these great, great stories. And it hurts. But what I want you to know is that negative responses are an indication that you are having a greater impact than you can even imagine. Because if no one is acting from this newspaper and reading it, there would be no reason for people to argue, fuss, and fight with me in the street. I'm just saying. So I had to change. This was my dream. This was what I wanted to see. I wanted my community positively represented. Am I gonna stop doing that because of the negativity? Am I gonna stop telling these great stories? No. I'm gonna grow from it, and I'm gonna continue going forward. Because in order to change, I have to be the change in order to embrace change. And I have to adapt. And I have to hold on to the little victories, like my neighbors that encourage me on and they say hi to me in the street. To the many people that contact the newsroom and remind us how they were able to act positively as a result of our coverage. To all the people that stop me on the street and invite me out to cover their event. To those that want to connect with the news organization and help us grow. I may never know the impact that this news organization might have. I might never know that. We may never be this dream of being the CNN for Black folks. But what I do know, what I believe, is my passion, your passion. That's the most unique expression of ourselves. And as long as we're following our passion and being uniquely you, me, being uniquely us, then we are the change. You are the change. Thank you.